Thank you so much, everyone, for taking out the time to be with us. We'll begin in the interest of time, try and stick to time. Thank you so much, and welcome to this conversation on behalf of Economic Times. As I mentioned, we're trying to take this series conversation around supply chain for the automotive industry across the country, and already done a conversation in Delhi. This is the Bangalore leg. We shortly hope to move to Pune and continue the conversations. So while this is an on-ground, so hopefully some of that in the paper as well. And you all know better, and you've been hearing in the last 2 to 3 years particularly, what changes are happening and how much that is changing. So I'm reminded of a conversation I had with someone soon after the pandemic hit. And he was saying, we have a demand shock. And soon realized it was a supply shock actually. So that one line from the gentleman, it kind of just doesn't go. And that is what we are trying to still address and trying to build. So while we talk about that, we'll focus on the automotive industry and importantly, talk about the past. Supply chain professionals have to live with that hint of past, very importantly, with the promise of the future. So talk about that as well on building the digital part of the future. So I'd look for your expertise on how that could be done. And first, I'd like to request Himanshu to begin a inaugural note on that, a big picture, and then we'll go to Aditya.
Thanks, Ashu. Thanks, everyone, for coming up. We're doing this series of events, as Ashu mentioned. Like the focus has been on the supply side, right? Satya Nadella, even before the pandemic, very famously said that every company is a software company now. No company can afford to be a product company, right? Even in an automotive vehicle, up to 40% of the costs are software costs, right? So no company can afford to ignore the digitization or the softwareization part. Now, everyone, like every automotive company, like both Dheeraj and I are the co-founders of CapGrid. And while we used to work with a consulting division of a very large consulting player, and we worked with a lot of automotive players, right? And we saw in the last 5 years, everyone was focusing on how to digitize the processes, digitize their factories. Industry 4.0 has become a huge buzzword, big data. Everyone was focusing on the processes, the products, how to digitize those products, right? You look at connected vehicles, you look at smart vehicles. Now, everyone is focusing on processes, manufacturing, but what about the supply side was the larger question, right? You have those large tier 1 suppliers who are up to the mark of the OEMs, if not there yet, but are on their way. They are big, they have huge muscle, they have huge resources as well. But what about the smaller suppliers that shape up the industry? So we've tried to focus on the supply side, the digitization from the supply point of view. And that is one trend that we noticed. And that is why I think we have this August gathering, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of good ideas coming in on the digitization front. On the inbound supply side, of course, digitization has penetrated across layers, but a lot of these ideas, we as a very young startup, CapGrid, we are a 2-year-old startup, and I'm sure we have a couple of slides, so I'll just quickly walk you through. Yes. So as I mentioned, Dheeraj and I are the co-founders of CapGrid. CapGrid is an acronym for Capability Grid. Like we focus on the direct material, which is parts and components for an automotive vehicle. So the process of manufacturing or coming up with parts and components is capability driven, unlike a lot of other industries. So with the ever-increasing supply chain complexities, is it easy to drive innovation? The trend that we noticed as consultants also was the product life cycles are shortening. The facelift, every 5 years, there used to be a facelift for a particular car. Now it happens every 1.5 years, right? So there is a lot of innovation, a pressure on innovation and R&D on the manufacturers. Now, where should their focus be is the question. Apple, one of the most innovative companies in the world, does not get into manufacturing. It treats itself as an R&D, product marketing, and a distribution company. It did not enter into manufacturing because they knew what their USP was, right? So for an automotive, in the similar analogy, for an automotive player, what should be their USP? Like the trends that we observed was product life cycle shortening, a lot of electrification happening, smart connected vehicles happening, the players like Google coming up with softwares, self-driving cars, right? Now, the automotive players are under a huge pressure to come up with new innovative products. So where should their focus be? And that is what CapGrid is trying to solve. CapGrid is a design to deliver company. We consolidate the design to delivery cycle for B and C class parts because the gathering is from the automotive industry. I'm sure the gentleman here would understand. But all the parts where there is huge fragmentation, where there is a tail and spend, huge fragmentation, the spend might be low. For 30% of the bottom spend, there may be 70% of the SKUs. Now, our proposition is that manufacturers should be focusing on parts and components where there is innovation involved, where there is R&D involved, such as A-class parts, and consolidate the entire procurement, the design to delivery process with a player like CapGrid, right? Now, if we talk about digitization in this sphere, a big OEM may enter into an initiative of digitization with the bigger players. But what about those 20 crore, 50 crore, 100 crore MSMEs? They are like at the bottom end of the pyramid as far as digitization is concerned. And no OEM, in our opinion, can afford to individually take up that process of digitization with all their individual tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, right? So we are a tech company trying to consolidate the entire design to delivery process because we feel there are a lot of thousands of capable suppliers, very small suppliers, 20 crore, 50 crore, 100 crore, even 200 crores, where the OEMs individually cannot take up digitization or shouldn't be managing or focusing their energies on, right? So that is the company that we are building. Because in these categories, there are high hidden costs, there is fragmented spend, there is zero tech. You look at the suppliers, I'm sure all of the gentlemen here would have visited such suppliers. There is huge crunch in terms of resources, in terms of their appetite as well, right? And that is why we aim to be the tech first aggregator of these B and C components, right? And that is the company that we are trying to build. And keeping in mind the theme that we have in this moment for this session, I think just wanted to set up an overview in terms of how we aim to take up digitization. And I'm sure there will be a lot of great ideas that will come out of the session. And we are a startup, we are an emerging startup, and we would like to take up those ideas and implement so that we could solve a larger problem for the industry as well. So thank you again to everyone for coming up. I think I'll hand over the stage to Aditya.
Sure. So what caught my attention again in this, the few minutes was the reference to Apple. We're talking of automotives and the context of Apple. Now that gives you an indication of the change that probably is coming in. So Aditya, now it's over to you to set the big picture, the context, and then we'll open the floor for everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here today. I think a lot has been spoken about the context and how that is evolving. That is actually where I wanted to start as well. Maybe the last 15 years of supply chain, those were really about efficiency and cost, right? The talk was about lean, supply chains got longer, it was a stable geopolitical world. If there's another country where you got a part 5 cents cheaper, sure, production is shifting there tomorrow. But a lot changed in the last 5 years. And yes, COVID is the one that we talk about most, but I think geopolitics has become increasingly complex. We had the semiconductor supply chain shock, which was something very different and unprecedented for auto industry. And suddenly we find ourselves in a world where we are trying to solve for very different things. We are suddenly trying to solve for much higher volatility. We are trying to solve for increasing product complexity. The product itself, like Himanshu said, becoming a lot more digital. The update cycles are faster. There's just a proliferation of complexity. The margin pressures continue to be there. They continue to become more and more severe. There is a growing need for sustainability and ethical sourcing, both in conventional materials as well as new materials, not just from a social point of view, but those are becoming real costs as governments try to push the agenda for climate and make sure we don't kill ourselves by heating up the environment. Pace of innovation has increased. Electrification has actually brought in completely new elements into the supply chain which didn't exist before. So the previous shock was digital, suddenly a lot more electronics components, a lot more software. Now car makers are going to be the biggest buyers of batteries. So new components coming into the supply chain. A lot more data that is available. All of us are capturing it, sitting on it, still trying to really figure out what to make of it. The supply chain lengths, because of globalization, because of the trends of the past, become complex to a point where I don't think any OEM really fully knows where everything that's going into a car is coming from. You have visibility till tier 1s, some of the better ones have visibility mapped out till tier 2s. Beyond that, nobody really knows. And that is where the hidden shocks are, so to say, sitting for us. And then, of course, the trade policies and regulations are evolving on a daily basis. Governments are recognizing the importance of ensuring that the supply chain and the manufacturing is controlled within the nation, within the region. And that itself starts bringing in new complexities on how to think about supply chain. So I think the context has shifted from cost and lean and efficiency to actually risk management, resilience, and just ensuring that the factory keeps running. You're no longer trying to save that 5 cents on a component. You're trying to make sure that production doesn't stop on account of supply chain issues. And I think this was beautifully demonstrated by the semiconductor crisis. That's the example I really like. And I think it really showed the difference in the automotive world. So when the crisis hit, late 2020, early 2021, if you saw then on what happened to volume loss for different OEs in the first 4 or 5 months of that crisis playing out, you had few OEMs, Tesla, BMW, Toyota, minimal volume loss in production on account of semiconductor shortages. Tesla actually claimed, and what was backed by data also, was that they were largely able to mitigate any impact. Conversely, you had OEMs like GM, Volkswagen, Ford, the conventional big boys. All of them had, higher teens or even 20% plus loss in production volumes on account of chip shortages. Same world, exposure to exact same scenario, but very different outcomes. And I think what everyone learned was that beyond tier 1, beyond tier 2, they didn't know where the supply chain lied. The electronics components were actually tier N for them. Their supplier was maybe buying it. And that's where when shocks originated there, they suddenly didn't know how to interpret it, what to make of it, how to deal with it. And I think that really brought out how we now need to think of supply chain very differently compared to what was the need of the past in terms of just end-to-end visibility, ability to actually detect early warning signs of upcoming shock, being able to simulate the impact and actually calibrate the extent of response that needs to go in. And then eliminate those structural weaknesses in terms of single points of failures, duplication, building redundancy into the supply chains. Digital is, of course, really transforming the way all functions within an organization are done. From a supply chain perspective, we feel there are 6 set of advantages there are three which are, so to say, core in terms of service levels, where actually availability is the biggest one, and minimizing lost sales. That's where the focus is. Cost, all the traditional elements, managing inventories. But then the other part that's becoming really important and that digital is enabling is the transparency, the resilience on the supply chain, being able to transparently know, model, mitigate risks, and then agility and speed of any response, managing lead times and so on. That's something which digital is enabling. Use cases are across. The first one, as we like to call it, is a control tower. Essentially, one place where you have complete visibility of what's going on in your supply chain. The second one is in supply chain strategy and design, where you can essentially create a digital twin of your supply chain, simulate what happens in different scenarios, optimize, really understand the risk. The third one is around dynamic planning, being more scenario based, more automation, dynamic scheduling, and so on. And then the last one, of course, is ongoing optimization. So that's where we see supply chain for the future headed towards solving for different set of objectives and driven a lot more by increased data and visibility into the depth of supply chain.
Okay, so thank you so much for that larger picture, Aditya. Thank you indeed. So let's start with the conversation. Sudhir, as one of the premier commercial vehicle manufacturers, your large picture, and again, because that reference was made, by Himanshu, talking about the smaller ones. Now, if you can give us a picture of the smallest of suppliers for you, what kind of visibility and how it has probably impacted, if you can paint a picture, a big picture for that.
Sorry, is it okay now? Yeah. So what I was trying to say is there are multiple level of visibility, especially someone like in a commercial vehicle manufacturer. We operate in clearly the auto segment, which is the long haul, tippers, tractors, basically goods carrying stuff. But we are also into specialty vehicles, so defense, power solution, exports. So all these segments. Now what tends to happen is there would be a small supplier who will probably do me just 2 crores of turnover per year. But he's so important for me because if he doesn't supply me, clearly my defense vehicle cannot be made. And I cannot go to the defense ministry and tell him that, see, this guy is not able to give me, so can you allow me to use something else? That process is likely to be 3 years. And that visibility becomes a huge challenge for me because 2 crores, frankly, this year I'll be buying roughly 30,000 crore worth of material. There's no way I can have a visibility of how prepared my 2 crore guy is. And I have to deliver that order within 3 months. So that's a challenge which is very, very, and I hope the digitization solution will come up with something which will help me in that. That as far as the supply is concerned. But there is also another level of visibility which would be very helpful if we can work on that. And that is the development cycle of a component. So for example, right from an RFQ being given, an order being placed, a tooling go ahead being given, till the part is developed, the die is developed or the machining fixtures are developed, and the parts first sample being supplied, second sample being supplied. All this today is very little digital intervention in those areas. It is largely a supplier quality engineer or a development engineer making physical visits, trying to understand which stage it is. Sometimes he's able to do it, sometimes he's not able to do it because maybe the die maker is in some third place. So that visibility, if that can be converted into some kind of a digital solution, I think that is another level which will really help the industry. So I think these are the two things. One is the part visibility or let's say the material visibility. Second is the development visibility. I think these two are really the need in my opinion as far as we are concerned.
Okay, Rajesh, if I can request you to add to that from the supplier's perspective.
Yeah, thank you once again. Pleasure to be in such an august company, and as I was joking with 2 of our customers as well. So definitely, as Sudhir rightly said, for us, particularly being a tier 1, and operating in some of the safety critical components where you can't change any change that you have to bring in. You have to demonstrate that we have thought out the change and consequently the impact of that such change. So this process typically from intent to execution takes anywhere, if you are lucky, 6 months, sometimes even 2 years, 3 years. So we have the same problem, but maybe in terms of in size, magnified down in terms of size, but very similar. Like while we can map our tier ones, which are tier two, so OEM, but going down to tier N, right? Particularly electronics, where something happening somewhere, a flood in Japan, sort of pushes back your supply commitment. 4 months later, your supply commitment is gone because of something that happens today. We had zero visibility of something like that. So, and I think the pandemic taught us all to really map out at least to the next 3 levels of our supply chain to see and monitor inventories, monitor processes, monitor capacities, because the other thing, the unsaid portion of it is the demand variability, right? Particularly coming from a pandemic year when we had the industry had really low outputs, and fortunately the industry has been able to do extremely well. Year on year we have seen 25-30% growth, and this has happened by just sheer hard work across the entire automotive supply chain. And what happens is, as he rightly said, any new development to be able to predict the risks involved in it, and that is a humongous process. So building data, building in and identifying the milestones that we need to track and ensuring that we pay attention to the risks thereof. That is one aspect. And the second, what we try to do there is we actually break down our development cycle, look at the commodities. We know these commodities are the risk-prone commodities in this area. So that comes with that knowledge that is there with that development engineer. Once we lose that knowledge, then it sets us back. The tacit knowledge is lost. So that's a very key element, converting that tacit knowledge into a system or in trying to milestone them, right? Milestone them from a target, and someone keeps paying attention. That's one side. And second is, of course, having adequate inventory of your tier, the long-term supplies where you have a really long time, like steel, for example. Like being a tier one, like we don't, when there are particularly commodity price increases, we don't command the steel makers. We are not in their priority list, right? But at the same time, as you rightly said, just one part not being there, the entire vehicle is not built. So balancing that inventory, balancing the cost, and looking at risks, I think that's the challenges that we face a little on an ongoing basis. And digitalization and awareness of risk and trying to capture the information and taking actions at in terms of lead indicators. I think that would be the critical factors in terms of controlling supply chain variability.
Very interesting, because that input comes from a traditional company and Ashok Leylandn, which is very traditional. But Harendra, for the new gen companies and the electric way of thinking, how is that thought different? And the point that you refer to, the smallest part, and you mentioned about it, the smallest part can also cause a little bit of a problem. How, given the sheer number of the volume is lesser, how are you trying to address that challenge?
Yeah, thanks, Ashutosh. I'm sure this is okay. Yeah. So first of all, thanks to all the speakers. We are all touching the same flow of topic, and the problem remains same, I will say, but how you look into that is a little bit different. I will say in an EV or a technology-rich company, it's more important to get a more front-loading thoughts. Who are my technology partners? Who can be my technology roadmap, right? From the small, tiny semiconductor chip to the whole chassis design, and whosoever runs the whole supply chain for us. So selecting that from the beginning is very critical for EV to the success, as well as to the to sustaining the volumes. If given an example, like maybe if I can, there you go. So I think the famous movie, almost 30-year-old movie, forests come. And, the famous statement, it comes within first 60, 70 seconds of the movie, if you have watched this. Mama always said, life is like a box of chocolate. And if you were in US or Europe, you'll find the box of chocolate is mixed with a lot of, different kind of chocolates. And you never know what you are gonna get. So Tom Hanks says that, and actually life is not, it is just a global supply chain. I picked up from there, and all the big issues started somewhere around 2020. These are the few topics which everybody became expert, like COVID. TSMC is known to a 12th grade student. Everybody knows about semiconductor crisis, what it is going on. And more than that, a little bit going deep, people know that what is the fab, or which is the front end of the manufacturing, is driving that. So coming back to the point, what I was trying to raise, it's very important to understand the technology path and also the technology partners to engage with. The job becomes more easy. So you probably need to have more big data for that, a big brain, big thought process. Stay pause for some longer time, but take the right decision to be with the right technology partner. I'll put my emphasis on that. Of course, all these big things which happened in the last 2-3 years, I would say 4 years, a big lockdown. I have witnessed some of these lockdown situations in China. Started in March 2020. Actually, I was in a city called Xi'an when almost the things were almost getting locked down. Yes, I was lucky to get out of that place along with my boss, and somewhere around in couple of months there was a big crisis coming from steel makers. I think Rajesh mentioned about that. Many of them thought the world is not going to come back to natural situation. If you take, I think it's 2 billion tons what they produce globally, I assume. So that is especially Nippons of the world, plus Kobe, Baos, all the eastern side of steel makers, they shut down their blast furnace. And there's a whole economy behind that. And once you shut down, it takes almost like possibly 45 days to run it back. Huge crisis started in October, November. Then there were a lot of ships being stopped in Shanghai port, especially Australian ships, carrying all the wines to coking coal from Australia. There was a huge kind of tension between Australia and huge amount of trade was blocked. And then came the big front-end crisis from Taiwan, TSMC, SMIC, which was kind of blocked, part of Huawei group. The whole Western world has actually stopped giving them basic machines and equipments. That SMIC was holding almost like 25% of the fab within China. Just imagine, it's just coming to the grinding halt. Hong Kong, Shenzhen, actually many people think like this border, we have no visibility, much visibility, but the trade across Hong Kong and China is almost like 370 billion US annually, close to around half of the total Indian exports. That's the amount of trade which happens, and if that border is shut down, the whole supply chain of metals, semiconductors to the specialty metals is shut out of China or into China. So all the secondary processes are gone completely. And of course, if we can go to the next page. Yeah, there, oh, I'm sorry, the previous one. Yeah. So the last one was very interesting, that somewhere around, it's still ongoing. I heard that some of the cities in China are still going through some lockdown situation. In a way, like the metals and information doesn't come out, but they have a restricted way of people entering to certain zones. There was a Texas snowstorm. Two major commodities got hit. One of them was semiconductor, the wafer, and also the specialty plastics. Typically, the front end of plastic making, almost 40-45% of that plastic is actually generated by US. So invest the adipic acids and all those things, which is further developed to PA or PBT or other chemicals. So just imagine if those 45% are shut, the whole world came to grinding halt again. So there was a lot of, I will say, VUCA, which I think Himanshu also mentioned. Coming back to all these learnings, I would like to understand how close we are to experience similar situation in future and how prepared we are. Again, back to the original thinking, for a typical EV, small EV player sitting in India or somewhere else in Vietnam, or it is very important to start with the right technology partners and right technology. I have more options to make a change than a big giant automotive ICE engine company. So I think we are more of open book thinking, and we pay a lot of attention on front loading. Thank you.
So very interesting. This context of anything that could go wrong has been probably going wrong lately. York, because we are talking about the EV part of it, a little bit from you, and also from, are we on the right course then, learning to do it the right way, probably preparing for hopefully no other crisis like this happening?
So let me change the context a bit. We are a small player. Your tier one we don't even touch. So
if you can put the mic closer,
so our tier 3 maybe, or our tier 1 maybe your tier 3 or whatever it is. So things look very different for us, and our risks are extremely different. Right? So what Aditya mentioned, our struggles are twofold. We are getting a product new into the market, so the product acceptance itself is a doubt. If that isn't a doubt, how do you really plan backward? So you start looking at data from the beginning. At least that's where the source starts from. And if you don't have clarity there, it's very difficult to really predict back end. And therefore, as somebody mentioned, while it was a cost game, SCM has changed now into a risk game. And how much really should you back factor for that to really happen? So I would really be interested to know how, when you said your tier 2 could be our tier 1, how really that works. As he very correctly mentioned, electric vehicles are extremely dynamic. Everybody talks about them and they change very fast. Once they change, the whole supply chain changes back end. And therefore, getting a system to really make it work, we are struggling, to be honest. When I say we are struggling, it is as simple as sourcing material from abroad, specifically China and Taiwan. Material does not come, design changes, the activities back end changes, and it becomes a more complex method to solve. Somebody mentioned go local. Naturally, one method, the quick reaction is go local, and therefore the dependency goes out. But the moment you go local, the cost component goes up. And therefore, then the end product cost goes up, it becomes unviable. Either way, a company like us is competing against the substitutes. That's the ICE substitutes. And the moment you start going local, so it's a catch-22. I really don't have an answer. I know the problem, but I really don't know how to address the problem. We're trying to address it terribly, but not really successful in that. We talk about cells being the major component suppliers. You look at data talks about India should want about 220, somebody says 120 gigawatt hour. As in India, we are only looking at 50 gigawatt hour as of now under the ACC. So are we truly really ready? So what I'm trying to say is spin it around and see, are we really looking at it at a very bigger picture, or are we just trying to see, okay, let's pass the game and let's see how it really pans out? Things will change drastically. If the geopolitics is something which nobody can control. While a black swan event like in COVID, maybe people do de-risk it in their contracts. I don't think so. The contracts were honored in that time. So there are multiple complexities. However, the end customer is not ready to pay for it, unfortunately. It's economics. So whatever sustainability, ESG we may speak about, the end customers, and to build a prediction for a product or a component to come in it's a serious problem. I always thought supply chain was very simple, but it's damn complicated. So we need information. Now everybody talks about data. What kind of data are we looking at? There are various strands of data. Am I ready to share with him? I'm holding data. There are so many layers and layers and layers to it. Unless you peel it off, it doesn't really come out as a solution. We are all holding data as if it's going to give me gold tomorrow. I really don't know if it will. And do we have an open platform wherein I say, okay, I want to know it's going to come in tomorrow. I'm putting some GPS somewhere. I'm putting a shop meter somewhere. Kahan par hai maal? I really don't know where it is. So I'm trying to find out. But there's a limit till where you can reach. The power of data will only happen when you probably democratize it. Can we? I really don't know. And there are more questions than answers in my statement, but that's a struggle which we are probably going through. And we are finding our own ways to fight it. But naturally, when you try to fight it, there's capital going out, you have to pay more money to do that, and then you need to know where to reallocate the money. Is that the right place to allocate or not? So I don't know if I answered your question, did I make more confusion in the whole, but that is where it is.
From your point of view, sir, how is, you make critical parts, as we were just talking a little while ago. Without a seat, a car probably cannot work. Some of the other two-wheelers as well. Give us a sense of, for a smaller supplier like you, relatively smaller supplier like you, what are some of those challenges? Because the uncertainty that we are talking about, or that we've been talking about, that uncertainty, how can we break that so that there is more predictability? And that is what ultimately everyone's wanting to do. So,
yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me for this session. So, I have been lucky that I have worked through OEMs, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, up to Tier 3. So, at every node, there are different challenges, like some of you mentioned. So, OEM has a different challenge, Tier 1 has a different challenge. But as you move down, the biggest challenge, like you said, that we actually are so poor in managing our supply chain because of various compulsions. So finally, the businesses you have to run which are supposed to be profitable. Whether you run a 1 crore business or a 1,000 crore business, ultimately the aim is that we have to be profitable. So that profitability will come only if you convert whatever orders you receive. So our biggest challenge even today, most of them will agree, is how do we maintain that 100% performance on the orders you receive. So while we buy technology, we buy machinery, we have people, so your dependency on the next level, because you cannot do everything on your own. So you have to have a chain down the line. And there the biggest challenge, like we mentioned, is the visibility, and more than visibility, I think the commitment levels as you move down are lesser and lesser. So a lot of our suppliers are not so professional in terms of holding on to commitments, and they are not organized. So there is a lot of need to, first is to uplift those supply chain nodes. That is possible with the technology, where you give visibility on what is happening, integrating. I think the biggest challenge is to integrate the entire supply chain. If I am a supplier to say OEM like Ashok Leylandn, so down entire this last fellow has to be integrated in supply chain, and that is where I think the technology definitely will help. So whether the technology is affordable or not is a big challenge. Today, there are a lot of small startup companies who have done excellent job in terms of developing some small tool software. So you can talk anything like demand forecast or planning, or integrating a supplier to make him part of your system. So finally, like somebody said that the biggest parameter for a supply chain availability. So it can be at any point. The availability of material at any point of time in the right quantity is most important. So the biggest irritation comes when something is not available. So you cannot do anything if something is not available. So the delivery performance is the first thing. I think the cost and all those things, it is not that perpetually keep on reducing cost and all that. First is any company has to first perform on what the customer needs. So my customer is a market or it is a OEM, but I need to ensure. So whatever we need to do to meet that, we have to do that. And today, luckily, we are in a generation where technology is not a problem. So companies like CapGrid, have been working with them. So they are trying to do this. So what happens typically in traditional, ours also is a traditional company. There is a mindset to hold on everything. Just keep holding on everything. Don't leave it. Because there is some perception that, if I give away something, I lose control and all that. So consolidation, lean. So we have to be lean in our system. So lean is the only solution if you want to really perform. So everybody talks about lean management in manufacturing, this, that. Ultimately, if the supply chain is ignored, you will not be able to deliver what you want. So you will put crores of rupees in your investment, but you miss delivery, the way investment is a waste. So it's really time to focus on where we invest in technology on the supply chain part. So 100% delivery performance. And now today what happens, if there are 4 levels down the supply chain from OEM, so everything is honestly managed by buffer system. Every point there is a buffer. So having a buffer is good, but having a buffer without planning is not good. So inventory is where the biggest challenge comes. So that is the money. So everywhere money is stuck. And then if you don't have visibility, you don't have a system, you don't have technology to manage those things, finally you end up in obsolescence of inventory, you don't know what is lying where. So these are huge challenges actually. Every company I have worked, same set of problems, and to some extent our technology should solve the problem of de-risking the talent. So every company like OEM can afford good talent, the tier 1 can, but as you go down, the talent is totally missing, totally. So maybe one guy will be there, rest of the guys are not good. So technology has to play a bigger role in integrating and de-risking to some extent these challenges. And like somebody said tower, this tower and all. So what is tower? So if you really see, everybody is talking about chip and all that. So when the problem is very big, the whole universe will join hands to solve it. But small problems, nobody will come. You have to solve the problem.
Very interesting point that you mentioned. And that gives me a cue to talk about with so many suppliers, their sheer number, Himanshu, is so huge that there needs to be, and again, you hear it, you spoke about the smallest of the challenges. How do you aggregate them to have an element of reliability that they can work on? At the same time, availability for others, for the larger companies, is not a challenge.
Sure. No, I think 2 key points that emerged were like for the bigger players, availability is a challenge because there is sale loss involved, as Aditya also showed for a few of the larger players. For the smaller players, being nimble or flexible is a larger problem because product acceptance is the first stage they have to cross. For the larger players, they've already crossed that stage, right? Now, as Ram sir also said, most players try to solve it through a buffer at each and every tier, right? Which adds on to the fat of the company, which in the long run, you might solve the problem of availability, but you are adding on more and more fat, right? Now, there was also a point that was raised was, who do we partner with? Do we need separate tech partners in this entire process, right? Now, we are all supply chain folks. We are working with manufacturers, right? The top ones may be tech-enabled manufacturers. Maybe they'll have a certain flavor of technology. But for the 80% of the supply base in India, they have this word missing, which is tech, right? Now, a great point about democratization was made, right? Now, there is, I feel, a sense of democratization required at this tier. Like all manufacturers not trying to solve this problem individually, but joining hands and solving it through a common aggregator, like a common platform. There are, like, in these particular categories at the bottom tier, as Ram sir mentioned, there would be close to 15,000 manufacturers. Now, every OEM, there is such high degree of fragmentation in such categories that you cannot go about solving the problem individually. The tech partners that I think sir spoke about is a perfect use case in this scenario. You cannot solve this problem alone. Why don't manufacturers work with aggregators or tech platforms who solve the problem on your behalf with their own set of manufacturers, right? I think that is the way to go in case we want to be lean. Like the concept of lean in manufacturing has been floating for the last 30, 40 years. But what about a lean supply chain? How do you build a lean supply chain is the way to go. Now, COVID showed us a lot of facets, right? A very important event also happened in 2011, like the tsunami in Japan. Now, Toyota didn't have a clue where its tier 2, tier 3 suppliers were, and the production got shut. They initiated a project which is, if I remember correctly, Project Rescue. They ran it for 5 years. They mapped out every single tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supplier there was to Toyota. It took them 5 years. Now, the question is, do the OEMs or manufacturers want to initiate similar cycles on their own? Do they have enough resources? And for the EV players, they have to be flexible, right? Now, the traditional players have a sort of a baggage, is what I feel in my experience, because it's a 120-year-old industry. People are used to carrying out stuff in a certain manner. But the EV players need to be flexible. Like Apple started in 2007. So they came up with a different perspective altogether. Had phones been manufactured since 1907, they would have continued doing the same way, right? So the question is, we want to achieve availability. We want to achieve flexibility. We need tech partners, which is true, and integration till the last leg. My only point I feel is, instead of going alone, I think there needs to be a democratization in terms of the initiatives we run. Of course, visibility is important. And as Ram sir said, we, during our consulting days also, used to hear about these problems like 10 years back. Now, the way that we've tried to solve this problem is through control towers. And I think Aditya also mentioned it. A sourcing control tower and a procurement control tower. I think sir mentioned we need to track development at each stage. Do we want our individual teams to do it for all of our 1,000 suppliers or 10,000 parts that are being developed? The answer may be no, right, in certain scenarios. Similarly, in the supply scenario, visibility. Now, how do we ensure visibility till the last year? What we've at least tried to do is visibility till 2 layers. Visibility of the stock that a company like CapGrid has, a visibility of the stock that CapGrid is expecting from its suppliers. Now, we're trying to expand and go deeper to the supplier networks. Can we extract data from their PLC so that we can take it on cloud and tell our customers about the quality, so that they need to be flexible, whether the parts can be shipped directly on the line, because we are bringing the visibility till tier 3. So I think democratization is the way to go, and joining hands is another way. And I think this was one of the other themes that emerged from our first discussion that we held in Delhi, that do we work alone or do we join hands? So I think an aggregator here might help, and democratization is the way to go, is what I feel.
Okay, so since this point was raised, the probably the platform kind of a thing, if I were to say that, how does that change? Because some of the smaller suppliers, the really small ones, they may still not be quite on the technology platform or the technology ready. How does that get addressed? Or what is your approach, if I may say so?
I think there are, before I get into that on the platform and the smaller suppliers, I think there is another level of visibility, while we are talking of visibility at different tiers in terms of material, another big challenge which has emerged off late, and it is likely to become even more challenging going forward, is while I have everything, I have machines, I have material, raw material, everything, but people don't show up. And the visibility of that is very difficult. I think that's another area which is going to, I've heard not just in India, but even overseas, some of the people just don't want to work and they don't show up. And because of that, we are losing production. So that is another important aspect in terms of visibility that needs to be built into whatever platform we talk about. Coming back to the platform, I think today the cost of technology has come down drastically. Vision systems, sensing systems, I think those costs have come down significantly. What can be looked at is, and I pick up a point which Himanshu mentioned about the quality. See, whether I am a Ashok Leylandn or whether I am a Rane Group or a IFB or Ather or Altigreen, for me, getting a quality part is important. Can I not use a common database or a common system, a common protocol, or a common platform, whereby the quality data of a component which is going to be shipped to me is uniform all across? In the sense, I use same protocol, use same software, I use same system. So whether a supplier A supplies a part to Ather, to me, or to Rane, the data in terms of how it is being captured and how it is being supplied is same. So what it will do is, it will bring down the overall cost of, let's say, digitization at the tier 1, tier N, whatever. Second, entire country will benefit in terms of upgrading the quality. And the disruptions will come down to that extent.
Who will build the cat, sir?
No, I think it's the OEMs. I think it's the OEMs who have to get together. And you see this a lot happening in Europe. Japanese, because of their, the Kairatsu structure and all that, anyway they do it. And in India, I think we are too timid as OEMs to collaborate in these kind of things. I think that's an area where I feel we should, give up our timidity. And I think the youngsters, not youngsters, but the newer companies probably are the best place to take this forward.
So, yeah.
So
I think.
So if I may just add one line to that.
Sure.
In terms of a question, how do the newer companies, the younger companies, show the way to the traditional industry?
I think the problems are a little bit different in case of, if you take pure EV versus the IC, some of the problems are generated by the process itself in a traditional company, and some of the problems are, I'll say, the risk of generating problems are low in a newer environment, I'll say. Because I have worked in both sides of the world, one of the key thing, I completely agree that there should be some common grounds, if you go one peel down, like for example, if you take a technology of, let's say aluminum, typically aluminum value chain is gonna be disrupted very soon. One of the key elements, if many of us know that to get a 1 ton of aluminum, you need to burn out 16 tons of CO2, almost. So just before pandemic, VW and few other European car makers, they've already signed up for the greener aluminum, green aluminum with so many kind of things. Like now, if you take a die casting supplier or a stamping supplier or probably any high tech semiconductor supplier, the one step below, I think, if you say typically for OEM tier 2, they're usually very open for such kind of topics. So if you go to let's say Nippon Steel, okay, and you ask for them silicon steel, what kind of, like, your last 20 years, what you have achieved in coercivity. Let's say one of the physics factor of that, which is very critical for traction motors or something. They will be, I think, if you're a good customer and they have a non-disclosures and things like that, they'll be open to show you those data. The problem comes how you connect between the tier -1 to tier -2. It is not easy. It is probably depends on the technology also, depends on openness, depends on how the OEMs are collaborating also. I believe there should be a collaboration and there should be pull instead of push. I believe that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to add on, I think what Sudhir has been mentioning about collaboration of OEMs in terms of modularization. The modularization, actually, we see that happening within the OEMs now. Like, say, typically, if a OEM was developing X number of platforms, we had to do X number of developments. But over the last few years, we are seeing a lot of modularization within the OEMs happening. Like, the BS6 environment that changed, we in fact supply to literally every commercial vehicle OEM in the country and some of the commercial OEMs across the globe also. So what we saw was significant modularity in design. So that has a direct impact on cost and on development time and making the processes interchangeable. And I think collaboration across OEMs is the next natural step. Just to quote an example, which is from a different industry, is what we see in the Type-C charger, right? Like mobile phones, like Apple was trying to use the lightning arrested chargers, but because of the government push in Europe, they are now forced to change to type. And that I'm sure will have a trickle-down impact on cost to the end consumer. So I think the OEMs internally have already started doing it. I think it's just a question of time before the cross platforms happen. And also the quality standards. And I think a lot of even traditional companies like us, we've also started investing in imaging detection. And we see, again, I think it's while some of us invest on technology from a being seen as doing the right thing, some of it actually makes business sense also, right? Because for us, inspection costs, the repeatability and of an individual and the cost of the individual, and as you said, getting the individual to show up on that day. So that vis-a-vis a machine that is there works 99.999%. While it makes financial sense, not just from a technology sense. So the point that I'm trying to articulate is, as long as we are able to standardize our processes, standardize our products and processes, then making those investments in technologies becomes that much more easier. And I think we are already sort of progressing in that direction as a country, as in sector and as a country. And I think it will be the next logical thing to do, would be my guess.
I think, Ashutosh, adding on to what Sudhir and Sir said, I think the answer to this lies in the aerospace industry as well. An aeroplane, typical aeroplane has 2 million parts, like 20 lakh parts. And a car has like what, 15,000 parts if you drill down to the last part. Now there is much more complexity in an airplane as compared to a car, right? Excuse me. So the problem that the way that they've tried to solve this problem is that there are tier 1s there are tier 2s there are tier 3s there. In every sub-junction, they have sub-tier suppliers as well. So between a tier 1 and a tier 2, there will be certain suppliers who will act as a junction between tier 1s and tier 2s. And similarly, between tier 2s and tier 3s, there is a junction where there will be a number of suppliers. Now, the OEM, the Boeings of the world and the Airbuses won't even bother about who their tier 3s are. They'll only bother about their sub-tier 1s and sub-tier 2s in certain cases, right? So they've brought down the complexity from 2 million to, let's say, 20,000 to a car. So that is how they've tried to solve this problem, and maybe the automotive industry can go that way.
That's a good idea.
And that's exactly what I was going to ask.
So so the problem here is, when you spoke about aggregation makes sense for commoditized product. It's easier to do that. When you look at new age products, so it may be a new age product, but the supply chain is still old age. That's a big difference in both the cases. A new age product company naturally is selling his product on some unique value propositions, and therefore it becomes that much more open or difficult to share, and therefore the aggregation model works to an extent, and it's a wonderful idea wherein certain cost components which are and if you really drill down the problems in terms of sourcing, mechanical components are not that much of a problem. The problem starts coming in electronics and the cells, and therefore at that point you want certain amount of uniqueness in your product. Does this aggregation model really serve there is a question which is a little difficult to answer, but that certainly makes a difference. To come back to your question of, so I would say the aerospace industry has been a little luckier because they've got two big boys. So everybody has to follow. And nobody can really play much in a space like ours where everybody's popping up with new idea, which is required, and therefore mobility as a solution changes. The value proposition changes. How do you want to move man and material changes? Everybody's looking at it from a new age. The complexities and the variabilities are much, much more. I'm not saying it's easier, but that's the way it is.
Okay, let me try. So we're talking of the pull factor here, consumers and the market forces. A little bit, Aditya, if you can add on the push that's coming. Europe, carbon tax, and the kind of pressures it will cause to whatever is being exported. And there is a market of our products that have to go from the automotive sector as well. What happens of that when that actually starts playing out? Because there was a reference to ESG as well. How does that impact, and what will it force? Consolidation at the lower level, will it?
Yeah, I think as that push has come in, the biggest realization has been that nobody really knows how much emission is getting generated in their supply chain where, right? People
Sorry to interrupt you. I think there are tools available now, and EU is institutionalizing that. Like if you recall that there was a tool called IMDS, some of us know. It was the first blockchain in the world, actually. Europeans do something, but they don't glorify it. Like they're not like Americans. So, so there is a tool. I will connect you on that. So that's quite close to IMDS, and it is also now talking about like whatever steel you're buying, where is the plant, how much your distance and shipping and all those things. So the world is getting closer to that, I think, to that value.
No, I think where I was going with that was fully take your point on the tool. In fact, as BCG, we developed our version of such a tool. It was called CO2.ai. It was so successful, we spun it off earlier in the year as a separate company. So, but those tools have come in. Having said that, they still require a lot of data to go in from the OEMs. They require that application to first of all develop that baseline. From at least my vantage point, I don't think OEMs are at a place where they have that complete visibility. But again, happy to be corrected by the.
I think your point is valid, but we are trying to do a similar exercise because now that ESG is while required from investor perspective, but it's I think an imperative from as a good corporate citizen perspective as well. My take on ESG is twofold. Also alluding to the carbon tax and all. First of all, the data capturing. Am I 90% accurate? I think it's good enough. Because at least on the 90%, I can work to reduce it by 10%, 20%. Yeah. So that's the, the first take on that. Coming on the carbon tax and other, my belief and with the little bit of, work that we have done with some of our vendor partners, I think India will find it easier, to meet the norms of ESG, especially from the carbon perspective. And why I'm saying that is, the cost of solar power in India is continuing to come down. Sooner or later, the cost of storing that power is also likely to come down. And therefore, our ability to become carbon neutral is likely to be much higher than what the Europeans are going to be able to do. And I'll give you an example. About 6 months ago or about a year ago, we started getting a lot of requests from some of our suppliers because there is a power cost increase. Ours is a lot of power intensive, so castings, forgings, sheet metal stampings. And so obviously they were incurring the cost because the electricity boards were just increasing the cost because they were having to subsidize something else. We started talking to our suppliers and saying that can we look at solar power as an alternative? And believe me, today there are a lot of suppliers in some pockets, especially Kolhapur belt and some of the southern suppliers who actually latched on to that idea. And now they've started using a significant amount of their energy mix as solar.
Yeah.
And that automatically does two things. It makes your product competitive. At the same time, it does the
for the
CO2 reduction. So absolutely.
Yeah. You basically get them to put captive solar, and that brings your electricity cost down to 3.5, 4.5 rupees, depending on the state you are in.
I was just going to add that, depending on the state you are in, because unfortunately some of our states,
Yeah.
we still have
Lot of restrictions.
very restrictions where it's not that conducive.
Correct. No, I think those are tough problems to solve. Look, solar, yes, great stuff is happening in the country, but all said and done, we are sitting on a few hundred gigawatt of coal-based power, and we are still adding about 40 gigawatt, give or take, of solar capacity every year. So, at a structural level, that energy mix will take some time to become green. So, I think as these European norms come in, like sir said, we are in a good place to respond to them. Having said that, that will not happen by itself. It will really take a concentrated, dedicated effort to understand where those emissions are originating and then how to control for them. Right? As a supplier, I can set up captive solar, but the place where I am buying steel from, that's a blast furnace versus a European supplier is using recycled steel. What do I do about that emission?
Green steel. Green steel is a reality again.
So again, but the years that we're talking about is obviously 10, maybe a little bit more as well.
Actually not, because talking to a lot of the steel mills, the big ones obviously, I'm not talking the small ones. I think combination of renewable energy, combination of hydrogen, it's not very far. Whether it's 3 years, 5 years, I think it's difficult to say, but it's not very far.
You're right. I think
just
Tata
so
Steel is working on that. We heard from Narendran, Dr. Narendran. And also, I believe I take a one step back. Like there is a problem which I want to raise over here. Maybe some of us can try to solve. There's a big threat coming up for all of us in the whole value chain. What's happening is there is a group of countries who are more restrictive on commodity pricing. Basically, commodity on the controls on the carbon footprint and CO2 emissions. Now, what it'll do is it's gonna put some pressure on the pricing in the West, like especially like aluminum, copper, or steel will go up, and usually the aluminum prices are all governed by one or two global set of points. So what you will land up in our country is probably you will not get a greener commodity, but more expensive, matching up to the global market. I really don't know how fast this avalanche is coming to us, but it's going to hit us very fast. So which forum we should go to talk about this? No idea. Yeah.
So because this de-risking or the risk factors is coming up, from your point of view, and we'll try and get everyone to talk about it, how are we looking to, what should be the building block for that de-risking thing that we are trying? So would you like to?
De-risking in supply chain?
Supply chains, yeah.
So de-risking in supply chain means different for different companies and at what level you actually are. So some companies are able to solve this problem easily, but some companies will not be able to. So again, the point comes back to how lean we can become in the supply chain from your individual perspective. How much I can handle, how much I will handle.
So smaller companies may not be able to do it alone, but if they aggregate something that we've been referring to, could that be a possible way to approach it?
I really don't know what exactly it means, because we have a lot of this group, what do you call this, ACMA, so many common, they have a common initiatives, but there probably they can discuss all those things there. So you have a lot of forums, can be done. But if you ask me, how do we solve the supply chain issues at a lower level? That is very, very specific in terms of how do you handle your basically commodities which are actually not adding too much value to your product, but without that you cannot survive. And it also fact that you cannot do it on your own. So aggregation at a level of OEM or is a different aspect. But aggregation, I would say, more to do with the commodity level. Companies like CapGrid who have come, there are few companies like CapGrid, they have taken this initiative for aggregating the suppliers at the C class level, what was presented. So that definitely, if you really see in any company, if you really look at what they presented, that stratification of value and number of parts, number of suppliers. So you will find a lot of numbers and suppliers in the lower value chain, which definitely everybody should think of offloading it. It will give you a lot of advantage in terms of utilizing your time, energy in focusing on bigger issues and managing the bigger things. So that aggregation, consolidation, you can talk anything. I think only two things matter now for supply chain is elimination and consolidation.
Okay. I like the way you put it. It's just for something as complex, you try to drill it down to something very simple. Okay, sir, point taken. Okay, we'll try and get one more round of questions before we try and wrap up. A question also of, there was I think you mentioned about the availability of people. Given the volatility that we're going to see, how do we prepare? How does the industry prepare for the specialists who could handle the situation like this? The uncertainty, the volatility, and plus the regulation.
Yeah, so one is, of course, specific skills which are very unique to that company, right? So obviously, one is on talent retention, and also in terms of arriving at a good amount of succession planning, and succession planning in terms of trying to identify, trying to train up, trying to de-skill, baseline the skill sets, and then look at systemically working up those skill sets. So that's one thing. And of course, I think with capital becoming less expensive year on year, I think the industry is also focusing quite a lot on low-cost automation tools as well. So, but it's an ever-evolving challenge, right? Like people having the right people at the right cost, at the right skill sets. I think that would be the biggest problem statement, which keeps most of us awake at night, I guess.
Sudhir, is it as simple as that?
So one thing which has been, I've been thinking about it and it keeps troubling me is that on one hand, there's a lot of talk about manufacturing jobs not available in India, or enough manufacturing jobs not available in India. On the other hand, you speak to any industrialist, small, big, whichever size, and they will say, I don't get people. So I don't know where this, why we are not able to match these two. And one of the things which, in my opinion, is that manufacturing, whichever tier it is, whether it's OEM or it's, I think we need to make the manufacturing place a little more ergonomic. Today, our manufacturing places, especially at the lower tiers, are really, hellholes to work in. How do you make them? And everything then boils down to cost. It takes a little more investment to upgrade them. Are we willing to pay for it? I think somewhere as a company or as a nation, we have to start uplifting our standards of work which are being applied at all levels. And I hope this ESG revolution will actually touch that. Once you start doing that, and I'll give a little bit of a parallel, this whole thing of drivers not available for driving a truck is mainly because the living conditions of a driver are horrible. And similar is the case at some of the tier ends in terms of the worker who is working. So if I can find some other way of getting a few thousand rupees and not having to work in that hellhole, why would I come to a manufacturing job? I think this is probably an area where probably all of us as a nation, as industry, as company will have to start thinking very seriously about. And that's the only solution I think we can solve. On one hand, lack of manufacturing job, and on the other hand, saying that I don't find people.
You want to come in, please?
Just one small change. So today, in fact, in the morning, I saw a wonderful post on LinkedIn, which was using AI to pick up productivity of 3 coffee shop suppliers and which one is giving more to the end customer. So they are using that as a tool to finally check the performance of the 3 so-called servers, whoever comes at the front end. Yeah. So in supply chain, productivity, availability, everything is a concern. So what we require now are, we have always maintained supply chain to be a disciplined, routine activity. We require more creative people who are looking at the problem very differently and not really at the visibility of the product. So you have to have a new set of people. At the bottom, yes, as he said, you require to have good conditions and all that is there. But I think he had hinted in one of the places that now the company is putting little more interest in supply, and they're not looking at it just it is more of a strategic player than as a one more who's just looking at operational efficiencies. So we need people who are looking at the problem differently, finding solutions differently, and thereby gathering data and thereby giving predictability to the whole value chain. It can't be done with the mundane activities of just capturing the way it is supposed to be. So I suppose, to answer your question, do we require a change in the mindset? 100%. Do we require a change in how to look at it? That also. And therefore, you'll have various layers of people at various points to be doing different activity than what they were doing earlier.
That reminds me, when OYO started, they didn't hire from the hospitality industry at all. It was a hospitality company, but they did not hire from hospitality industry at all because they wanted to bring in a fresh mindset, as you mentioned, right? So that is a very interesting take on how companies.
Yeah.
So I graduated in manufacturing engineering like 12 years back, and we find it very difficult to hire tech talent. Now I again go back to the same question, whether anybody would want to take up manufacturing right now, because like the tech market is really hot. So with tech coming in, would we be able to find the right manufacturing talent 10 years from now is the big question.
Yeah, so I think we need to peel off this problem. This problem is very big. It's going to be bigger and bigger coming time. The way we are having more manufacturing or maybe software offshoring, I'm sorry. So I believe that we have to look into the strategic roles, mid-level roles, plus also hands-on kind of operational roles, and also in the tier like OEM back to all the value chain. The success lies with the human operations team, I think. The company should put more collaborative efforts with the people operations. Some people call it POPs, we call it POPs, or traditionally human resources or human capital engineering. Understanding, giving people a chance to do something else, what they are doing, is also always engaging. Okay. This is one thing. On the other hand, I'll give you an example of just go and look into the key positions of Tesla. They have kept themselves away from original OEMs, like even at the CXO levels. Yeah. So you have to bring in some new ideas, make it more interesting at the workplace. Of course, the inflation will go up. The place I was working before was 2% salary increase. Now, I don't know how much we have to settle. Every year we have to increase budget. So, but besides that, it's also culture plays a very important role. I don't know how much it will be successful if you go down to a very small scale supplier, but I have seen some small scale suppliers where they engage with their people very, very nicely. Of course, it depends also, is it a plating shop or a stamping shop? Yeah, all those things matter. Yeah.
Okay, Aditya, I wanted to just put a question while you make a point. Some of the issues that were raised of the people, the kind of working conditions, how does the country look to be a smarter manufacturing destination and, seize the supply chain opportunity as well, given the realities we face and the opportunity we see?
Before coming to that, I just wanted to add to the discussion that we were having around talent. From a manufacturing perspective, I think it got covered quite well. But I think if I look at it in a slightly broader automotive context, the skill sets that are required and the pools that we are competing with is also changing significantly. A point was made about Tesla. Conventional OEM R&D organization looks like chassis, E&E, body, so on and so forth. Tesla's starts with hardware and software. That's the way they are structured. That's how important software is in that organization. The talent pool there, like we spoke about semiconductors as a component. The talent pool here, you're competing with the FANGs of the world in trying to attract them, and basically you're going to a software engineer and saying that you could go work at Amazon, but actually I as an OEM is also a great place to work at. How do you even sell that value proposition? How do you get those people with the increasing software content? That's no longer an option. Even in very conventional areas, like, or not conventional, but very fungible areas, adding so much software into the car, somebody needs to look at cybersecurity. Now, those cybersecurity professionals could be doing anything in the world. They could be working for financial services, they could be working for cryptocurrency, they could be working for marketing organizations. You have to attract that talent. The other part of it is even on the manufacturing side, yes, just getting people to keep the shop floors running is a challenge. But as more and more volume shifts towards EVs, the skill set that is required is going to change. Are we geared up to reskill the people who are there? Auto industry today, depending on who you ask, employs 3.5 to 4 crore people. Many of those jobs will reduce in quantum and over 20-25 years disappear. What happens there? What are we doing there to actually reskill them? And
I'm
ensure
reminded
that
of
they
the
can come back?
PCO, you know, there was a time when
they were
PCOs
PCO
happened.
operators. Now,
Yeah.
you know,
They don't exist today.
they don't exist anymore. So I think that piece of puzzle, again, that's something which an individual OEM or an individual supplier cannot solve at their own level. That I think again becomes another area where government, universities and the OEMs really need to come together into what is that new curriculum, who is administering it, what's the new certification basis which we will really absorb these people in the industry. And I think that is a big problem we sit on.
Harendra, if I can have a small answer and then we'll go around to the closing. Please.
Shall I? Okay. So I think Aditya, you mentioned right. It is for people like us in EV, we have a very huge content of software. So it's very big problem to retain, and especially in Bangalore. And but on the other hand, you mentioned about hardware and software. Not to be poached, we have two big pillars. Both are from Cupertino. Apple guys heading hardware and software for us. Very strong guys, non-automotive guys, real principle, non-automotive guys, almost there for 5-6 years. So I think the pillars are required.
Sure.
The strong pillars are required, then you have a good team.
Okay. So let's start with the closing point. If you'd like to, we're trying to make it quick.
Yeah,
Please.
so I think one of the elements that we didn't discuss, and I think I just wanted to bring it up at the end because I think it's very important, is there are different supply chain risks, but one of the key risks which is going to become very, very important is the availability of these materials like lithium, cobalt, tin, copper, aluminum. And there, I think as a nation, we have to become very strategic, which I think since we are trying to get into partnerships with some of these countries, because securing the supply of those critical minerals is going to be the next big challenge in terms of the supply chain, is what I feel.
Rajesh.
Yeah, from my side, just to another perspective that we couldn't discuss is also the way the industry is going to change and evolve, right? Today, typically in a traditional ICE engine vehicle, we have X number of suppliers. In a non-ICE environment, or how it shapes up, the number of suppliers is going to be maybe 1/5 of the current suppliers. So what is going to happen to them, or how the remaining suppliers were able to jockey for those remaining 1/5 of the parts? The entire supply chain today is going to jockey for the 1/5. So I guess the ecosystem is going to get more and more complex. So that's also a risk that I thought I'll table it here.
Sure. Amit, please.
I think I'll take it that the idea of probably having some control over raw material, could be lithium or whatever. These are more government driven. So that is one. Number two is build, I would say, friendly nation networks little more, and therefore you have little lesser hostile supply chain risks. So again, that's again driven by government, not by us. Data sharing is more industry issue. I believe we have to come to a common ground. Again, a very difficult activity to do, but yes, data sharing allows more visibility, more predictability on what is, and if that is possible. Possible solution, as you said, aggregation, if data sharing happens, the aggregation becomes an easy activity. So that's an offshoot of that. So these are 3 or 4 things really happen naturally. Then use the technology. Technology can only enable, it can't really change the mindset. So technology comes later on. Change the mindset first, and naturally the government also has to support to some extent to build local, so as to which they are doing, but I suppose they have to do a little more depending on the money we have as a country. That's their own challenges. Those are mine.
So, if your last point, please.
Yeah, taking the cue from Sudhir, this manpower issue will remain a big challenge in future, and our problem in India is that we don't have scale to go for a large automation, like what developed countries are doing. I don't think they have too many issues on manpower because they have so much of huge scale on the volumes. They are global. So I think India has to become really global, and probably what scale we are operating today, should become 10 times. Probably that the 10 times scale will solve this problem to a large extent, because you will able to invest in technology, invest in automation and all those things. So if you typically compare car industry or manufacturing in India and maybe Europe, or actually you have to really search for people in the factory. When you see a video clip, you have to search really where you don't find anybody in the factory. But if you take a video of, you will find only people in the shop floor. Everything filled with people and material. So I think scale is the biggest challenge for India, and once we do that, probably most of these issues will get solved. Now, if you look at the population, what they will do, probably something else will come for them.
Okay. Harendra?
So I think a couple of points on let's say the whole ecosystem is already having a lot of risks in value chain, supply chain. Risks are going to be more and more. Politics as well as geopolitics is going to play a big role in policies. A couple of years are challenging especially for EV industry. On the front of digitization or digitalization, a word of caution to all is that it is important to adopt a tool, but it should be very important to see what do you need as an organization. What are your drivers? How you do business? How you execute your own thing? Many times we make a very common mistake where we take, I would say that a ready-made solution, and for which 50% of the people don't understand what to do. What is this beast is? So it's very important. It should be inside out kind of thinking from the digitization and digitalization point of view. On the topic of people, I think the human resources in India are excellent. I think second to none. The kind of people we have to tap it with the proper, ownership, think like an owner kind of, mentality. That needs to be induced amongst the human resources, a strong human resource department or people, operations. On the policy side, just distributing some money is not the only thing we need. I think more or less the whole value chain should be looked in. I take one example, like if you talk about cells, like, we're distributing cell money to many people. It should be more important to see whether we are capable to make lithium hydroxide here instead of you still get to the bottleneck countries and then you're again stuck. So, and lithium, to be frank, that sea is not actually extracting. Most of the lithium is coming from Australia and ABC and South Central American countries. So, or somewhere in DRC area, So that's important thing. We will expect from policymakers to look into the whole value chain, not look into just the final product and make it glorified. That's what, as a voice, I would like to speak out. Yeah.
Actually, I really wanted to echo the point that was made. Let's say for EVs, we say that motors are now made in India, and everybody is using Indian motors. if the magnet in there is still coming from China, and that's 50% of the value, have we really de-risked? Have we really increased the resilience? Answer is no, right? So looking at the supply chains to their complete depth, and then like he said, solving for them fully end to end, I think that is really important. Otherwise, we would have just moved the issue one more arm's length away, and in the process maybe increase the danger, because around us we see that, yeah, I'm seeing local supply chain, I'm in a good place, not realizing that the underlying drivers have not changed. And in fact, I have become slightly blinder to the risk because I have pushed it one step away.
In fact, if I may just add here, you want to talk also about the PLI scheme, because again, the larger companies, the ecosystem is not benefiting enough. You wanted to make that point.
So I think on the PLI schemes, fantastic initiative, absolutely in the right direction. The complexity is that these supply chains are again composed of multiple actors. Barring the biggest cell companies in the world, the other ones simply cannot afford to do the active materials, the foils, etc., everything themselves. They are not the natural owners of those processes, right? So doing PLI for, let's say, just cells or for some of the other components, that's a great start, but that's not a place where we can stop. And
I would like to, sorry to interrupt you, if you allow me. No, it's very important to create a balance between PLI and subsidy. Yeah, there should not be confusion to the industry. On one hand, you take PLI, one hand you take subsidy, and there's a confusion. The rules of the game should be set. It should not be like you have a first half you had T20 and second half you say we'll play football now. So that's very, very, very damaging to the whole
ecosystem
strategic plan for next 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Himanshu.
No, I think as the topic future of automotive supply chain, nobody here will disagree that the future is electrification, shared mobility, connected mobility, right? And a subset. Now, auto is fighting a war against the non-auto companies, so as to speak. Auto is fighting a war against tech companies and the digitalization. I know a lot of founders who are tech founders who are building EV products now and successfully doing that, right? So in terms of talent as well, we are fighting for good tech talent, because 40% of the vehicle's cost is a software-driven cost, right? Connected services, shared services. Now, Ubers of the world are guiding how vehicles should be made, right? 15 years down the line. So auto is being pressurized by non-auto players, so as to speak. Tech companies, non-tech companies. Google is building the heart of the vehicle, driverless cars. Now, auto, does it want to be reduced to a contract manufacturer building the structure of the vehicle, or moving towards the tech part or the digitalization part of it as well, both in terms of processes and products, right? I'm glad, I think, as Harendra mentioned, that they have folks from Apple, in an auto company, so as to speak, right? So that speaks for it. I think there will always be this chicken egg problem in terms of whether we digitize first or we chase scale first. And that is why schemes like PLI, subsidies will also come in handy. I think we'll see a lot of those in the next 15 years. But I think the onus largely lies on the group like this to take the industry forward and solve for the challenges that we are trying to solve for.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. Fantastic speaking. And what I take back is, of course, the challenges that are facing, which anyway exist, but the point that Apple thing has stuck in the head now. That point. And again, that's the larger point. Banking is being reshaped by technology. Auto is being reshaped by technology. Technology is reshaping. So it's about aggregating probably and thinking about 5 years later, probably. That could possibly be, and of course, you guys are the people who will execute it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being a part of this conversation and joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.